Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Gungaloo Country in Queensland. And before we dive into the conversation today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community.
The Lentil Intervention is an Australasian educational and advocacy platform dedicated to raising awareness about the current climate and health crisis.
And on this podcast, we invite guests to chat about topics that will inspire you to take action to improve your own health and the health of the planet.
So please subscribe to and share this podcast and visit our website for the full show notes.
And don't forget to buy us a coffee if you'd like to support our work.
Season 2, episode 48. And following on from the last episode with Dr. Mike Joy, we bring you the final recording from the Evidence-Based Eating New Zealand series of health-focused public lectures. Episodes 18 to 20 were the Dunedin-based lectures. Episodes 30 to 32 were Christchurch. Episodes 40 to 42 were Auckland. And the Wellington theme was the Ministry of Health that was held on the 30th of October.
In this episode, we bring you the recording of Dr. Luke Wilson. Here, Luke discusses the need to change nutrition guidelines, pivoting away from animal and processed foods towards plants. Luke is a great friend of the show and was featured as our first ever guest, Season 1, Episodes 2 and 3, and helped us wrap up our first season, which was Episode 28 of Season 1.
Tēnā koutou, ko Luke toku ingo, no whanganui a te rā ahau, ko kai mo te manua, te ingo o Takakuru o mō tēnei pō. Kia ora, my name's Luke and I'm from Wellington, and the name of my talk for this evening is Food for the Heart. Kia ora for your stellar introduction, Martin, so I can skip through most of this one. But I will say that I grew up in Newtown, Wellington, and I did my medical training at the University of Otago. I work as a GP in Miramar, but my real passion is for lifestyle medicine. I have my own lifestyle medicine consultancy business called Two Zesty Bananas, and I'm also board director for Doctors for Nutrition, which is an Australasian health promotion charity, and that's where I got this Flash t-shirt. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about how we can eat for a healthy heart particularly, but as you've also heard from the earlier speakers on this evening, that this way of eating is also particularly healthy for us in many other ways as well. So I'm going to talk also a little bit about our official dietary guidelines, but I know there's also a lot of information out there from unofficial sources about how we should be eating. You've probably heard of a plant-based diet, a vegan diet, a vegetarian diet, Mediterranean diet, maybe the ketogenic diet, maybe the Paleolithic diet, perhaps 5-2, perhaps the Fast 800, perhaps Atkins, and I could go on. So this is a really good thing because it's great that we're all interested in our health and our nutrition especially. Humans have always been very interested in our food, but at the same time, it can create a bit of confusion about which one of these ways is actually going to be the best way and the healthiest way for us to eat. So really my goal tonight is to help clear up some of this confusion so that all of you can go away with some simple principles about how you can be eating for your best overall health. And in order to do this, I'm going to put this proposition forth tonight, that all we actually need to do in order to have a healthy heart and a healthy life is to eat like the people in the world who have the healthiest hearts. So, who are these people? And more importantly, what kinds of foods do they eat? Now, first off, we have the Okinawans. And you might know that Okinawa is an island off Japan. The Okinawans are renowned for their long and healthy lives. Okinawan women are more likely to live past the age of 100 than are women anywhere else in the world. And as you might expect, the Okinawans have very, very low rates of chronic disease that we experience in New Zealand. Historically, it's been really hard for anyone to find cardiovascular disease or coronary artery disease, particularly in this population. And as recently as the 1990s, a study found that for Okinawan men, they were only 1/6 as likely as the average American man to die of coronary artery disease. Okinawan women, well, they did even better. They were only 1/12 as likely to die of coronary artery disease as the average American woman. So, what kinds of foods do you think the Okinawans might eat? That's a genuine question, so any takers? I've got a few fish, I've got some rice. Someone mentioned potatoes. Soy. Well, the answer is actually sweet potatoes. They eat lots and lots of sweet potatoes. If the Okinawans had a motto for their food, it would be eat food, not too much, and mostly sweet potatoes. An incredible 85% of their diet comes from carbohydrates. And of that 85%, 7/10 comes from the Okinawan sweet potato. They do have some beans and rice for variety as well. Now, the next population I'd like to talk to you about tonight are the Raramuri people. Now, Raramuri means, or loosely translates as, those who run fast. And these people are found in northern Mexico. They're renowned for their legendary feats of physical endurance. And in fact, what the two boys in the picture there are doing is playing their traditional game, Rarahipari. Now, when they play the Rarahipari, what the Raramuri people will do is they'll put on those wooden sandals you can see them wearing there, and they'll run over some rugged mountainous terrain, kicking a wooden ball for 10 kilometers. And that would be considered a casual game of Rarahipari. For a big game, or a test match, if you will, they'll put on the same sandals, run over that same rugged mountainous terrain, kicking again the wooden ball for anywhere between 50 to 240 kilometers over up to 2 days and 2 nights. So that's about the distance of running between here and Napier. Deaths from cardiac and circulatory complications are unknown in this population. So, anyone got any ideas what kinds of foods the Raramuri might be eating? I've got some beans over there, yep. Anyone else? Corn. All right, that's actually perfect because 90% of their calories come from corn and beans. And the vast majority of the rest of their calories come from vegetables, like the squash that's pictured there. These 3 food groups, or 3 crops, are known in Native American tradition as the 3 sisters: beans, corn, and squash. And that's because they grow particularly well together, and also because these kinds of foods are what have sustained populations, or many generations of their populations, over a long period of time. Now, the last group I'd like to talk to you about tonight are the Tsimane people. The Tsimane are also found on the American continent, a little bit further south, in South America and Bolivia. The Tsimane were studied relatively recently, and the conclusion of that research was that this was the population of people who had the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease ever recorded. In order to do this, they somehow convinced 705 of the Tsimane to undergo a coronary artery calcium scan. So that's basically a scan that looks to see if there's any calcium in the arteries going to the heart. So it gives us a good indication of whether there's cardiovascular disease present or not. Incredibly, 85% of the Tsimane had no coronary artery calcium whatsoever. And when they looked at the 80-year-old Tsimanes, or 80-year-old plus, they had the same vascular age, so their hearts, the arteries going to their hearts were about the same age, on average, as Americans who were 3 decades younger. So, what kinds of foods do you think the Tsimane might eat? Potatoes. Any other ideas? There's a clue there because they are harvesting one of those crops in that picture. But in that picture, they're harvesting some cassava, and 72% of their diet comes from carbohydrates. So they're also fond of rice, plantains, and corn. So now that we've looked at these 3 populations where cardiovascular disease is virtually non-existent and where they live very long and healthy lives, we can start to draw some conclusions about the types of diets that these people have. Basically, they're basing the majority of their calories coming from these 3 sources of unprocessed carbohydrates: beans or legumes, whole grains, and starchy vegetables. Or a really easy way for us to remember that is simply to think of the three sisters of the Raramuri people: the beans, corn, which is actually a whole grain, and squash, which represents starchy vegetables. Now, when we look at the macronutrient composition of their diets, so this is the percentage of calories that comes from carbohydrate, protein, and fat, what we see is their diet is very high in unprocessed carbohydrates. So they get about 80% of their calories on average from these. Just 10% from protein, but as we've seen, this is enough for them to live very long and healthy lives, and also in the case of the Raramuri, to do some running on the side. And just 10% of their calories come from fat. What does this lead to? A total cholesterol over their entire lifetimes that's well less than 4.0. But you might know that in New Zealand, we have over 170,000 people living with cardiovascular disease. And one New Zealander will die every 90 minutes from cardiovascular disease. So what would happen if we took people who already had cardiovascular disease and asked them to eat like the populations that we've just discussed? Well, fortunately, these three gentlemen, or three brothers if you like, have spent the better parts of their careers studying this exact question. Now, first off, we have Nathan Pritikin. Nathan's a really interesting character, and in fact, he was an inventor originally from Chicago. At age 42, Nathan was diagnosed with severe coronary artery disease by his cardiologist. Now, Nathan didn't want to believe this. He was a bit hard-headed, and so apparently went to see not one, but 12 other cardiologists for a second opinion. So it was just as well he was already a millionaire by that point. When they all came back with the same conclusion, that he indeed did have severe coronary artery disease, Nathan decided he would do something about this. And what did he do? He changed his diet to be more like those populations that we've just discussed. Nathan saw his cholesterol drop from a sky-high 7.8 all the way down to 2.6 over just 2.5 years. He went on to write 5 books, publish hundreds of research papers, and also to establish the Pritikin Longevity Center, which you can see there in the background, and is now based in Florida in the United States. In the foreground, we have one of his first patients. This is Frances Greger. Now, Frances had severe coronary artery disease, and when she was age 65, she presented to the hospital once again with severe chest pains. And when she did, there was nothing more that the cardiologist there could do for her because they'd already done so many stents and bypasses. So the only thing left was to send her home in a wheelchair with what was essentially in those days a death sentence. Fortunately for Frances, one day she was watching 60 Minutes and she came across a segment on Nathan Pritikin and his longevity center. So she decided to head down there. Now, after just 3 weeks, not only was she out of her wheelchair, but she was walking 10 miles a day. And she went on to live 28 long and healthy years at home when she was discharged. Unfortunately for Nathan, this isn't where his story ends. He was diagnosed with not one, but 2 severe medical conditions during his 40s. And the second was leukemia. And when this came back from remission, he decided that what he wanted to have do when he died was an autopsy, so that people could see once and for all if he'd managed to make any progress on his coronary artery disease. And I'll just read you the conclusion of that autopsy report. In a man 69 years old, the near absence of atherosclerosis and the complete absence of its effects are remarkable. Next up, we have Dr. Dean Ornish. Now, Dr. Ornish is from Texas, of all places. And in between his 2nd and 3rd year of medical school, what Dr. Ornish decided to do was to take 10 patients with severe coronary artery disease, much like Frances Greger. These were patients who would get severe chest pains when they were doing the most mundane things. They might just be taking a short walk, shaving, or having a shower, and they have the onset of severe chest pain. And what Dr. Ornish did is he put them up for a month in a hotel, and he got them to make lifestyle changes, one of which was to change their diet to be more like the 3 populations that we've just discussed. He found that in these patients, after just 1 month, every single one of them had seen the disappearance of their chest pain. And for many of them, this happened within weeks, if not days, of starting his program. He also looked at the blood flow to their hearts, and he found that after 30 days, just 30 days, Most of them were also showing that the blood flow to their hearts was improving in that short period of time. Dr. Ornish wasn't satisfied with just this one study though. He went on to look at another two groups of about 30 patients each. And this time what he wanted to look at were their angiograms. And you can see a picture of an angiogram in the background. And basically what this is an X-ray of the blood flow to the heart. So it can show us if there's any narrowings, and it can also show us, Dr. Ornish was hoping, if there's any widening of the arteries that would suggest that the blood flow is improving. So what Dr. Ornish did is he got these patients to make the lifestyle changes in one group, and the other group continued on with their expert care from their cardiologists. You can see from the graph that after 1 year, Dr. Ornish found that over 80% of his patients had changes in their arteries, suggesting that they were opening up again. And when he looked again at 5 years, the changes were even more substantial. Unfortunately for the patients who didn't make those lifestyle changes, their coronary artery disease continued to progress. And because of this, it's not surprising that there were less than half as many cardiac events in the group that got to make Dr. Ornish's changes. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. Now, Dr. Esselstyn was a surgeon originally from New York, and he practiced most of his career at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. He was also a gold medal winner, winning the gold medal at the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne for rowing. When he retired from surgery, what Dr. Esselstyn decided he wanted to do was to help patients with coronary artery disease improve their symptoms with dietary change, just like we've talked about with the other two doctors before, the other two researchers before him. Dr. Esselstyn, perhaps because he's a gold medal winner, or perhaps simply because he was a surgeon, is definitely the most prescriptive of the three brothers. He recommends that patients eat only from the three food groups that we've discussed tonight: the beans or legumes, whole grains, starchy vegetables, normal vegetables are allowed, and so is fruit. He's really insistent that patients avoid oils and also high-fat plant foods like avocado, nuts and seeds, and coconut. He also really is a big fan of the green leafy vegetables, and the reason for this is because they contain compounds that help to open up the arteries. And this is one of Dr. Esselstyn's first patients. This is actually a friend of Dr. Esselstyn's from the Cleveland Clinic, another surgeon called Dr. Joe Crow. Now, Dr. Crow, at age 44, had a heart attack, and you can see the results of his angiogram there on the right. You can see there's a severe blockage in the distal left anterior descending artery, which is one of the main arteries going to his heart. Fortunately for Dr. Crow, there was nothing that the cardiologist could do about this because of the position of the blockage, so they couldn't offer him a stent or a bypass. And of his own accord, Dr. Crow decided that he wasn't going to take a statin. So really he had no option left to him except to wander down the hallway to Dr. Esselstyn, knock on his door and place himself at Dr. Esselstyn's mercy. So that's what he did. Dr. Crow's cholesterol dropped from an initial 4.0, which we wouldn't usually think of as being particularly elevated at all, but he managed to get that down to 2.3 with diet only. And everything seemed to be going pretty well for Dr. Crow, until a couple of years later, when he was going through quite a stressful time at his work, and he had the return of some chest pain. So, of course, the cardiologists were quite concerned, and so they took him back and looked to see what his angiogram would be showing again. And you can see the results there on the left, and the results really speak for themselves. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah. They're on my left, sorry. Okay, so now we have some more before and after pictures of one of Dr. Esselstyn's patients. And this time we have a scan that's showing the blood flow. In the top picture, you can see there's an arrow pointing to an area that has significantly reduced blood flow. And in the bottom picture, you can see that this has increased significantly. And so this is a multiple choice question for everyone here tonight. And also people watching, I suppose, you can answer too. But I'd like to see a show of hands, please. Who thinks that there's 3 weeks between these two pictures? Any takers? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A few brave people. Who thinks that there's B, 3 months between these two pictures? The 3 months have it at the moment. And anyone think it was 3 years? We have 1 person, 2, 3 for 3 years. So those of you who put 3 weeks, you're absolutely right. And you're starting to see just how powerful dietary change can be for your health. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Esselstyn's diet could be seen by many as being quite prescriptive. And so Dr. Esselstyn decided that what he would do is that he would look at 198 of his patients over a follow-up period of just over 3.5 years and see how many of them were actually able to stick with his diet. Well, actually 89% of them, or the vast majority of his patients, were able to. Now, of these patients, remember that many of them were in a situation just like Francis Gregor or Dr. Joe Crow, or some of the other patients that we've talked about tonight, and they had severe coronary artery disease. So basically, they might have had their first heart attack before, severe angina, maybe a bypass or two, and they obviously had a lot of cardiac issues that had been coming up over the years. And so they were obviously a population that was at very high risk of having a repeat cardiac event. So how many of Dr. Esselstyn's patients who stuck with his diet had a recurrent major cardiac event during that time? Well, incredibly, just 1 out of the 177 who stuck with his diet had a recurrent major cardiac event. That's a recurrent event rate of just 0.6%, or close enough to 1 in 200. However, you're probably also thinking there were also 11% who didn't manage to stay with Dr. Esselstyn's diet. Now, remember that this 11% of patients had obviously had Dr. Esselstyn's counselling. So it wasn't as if they were thinking a ketogenic diet or a Paleolithic diet might be the best thing for their hearts. And of course, they were also getting the best care that their cardiologists were able to provide for them during this time, because this is, of course, what Dr. Esselstyn recommends. So how many of them ended up having a repeat major cardiac event during this time? Well, staggeringly, 13 out of 21, or 62% of them, had a recurrent major cardiac event during that time. So they were over 100 times more likely to have a recurrent cardiac event than the patients who continued following Dr. Esselstyn's plan. So that was a lot of numbers and facts. So I put this slide of the beautiful Okinawan Islands here to remind us all, and particularly myself, to take a deep breath before we get into the next part of the talk. We're going to talk a little bit about our dietary guidelines. So let's take a look at New Zealand's dietary guidelines, or actually before that, why don't we have a look and see how we're doing already in New Zealand relative to the populations that we've discussed tonight. Well, as I've shown you, the 3 populations that we discussed tonight, when we look at their macronutrient composition, they average out with about 80% of their calories coming from unprocessed carbohydrates. Just 10% of their diet comes from protein, but we've seen that's more than enough, and about 10% from fat. So how are we doing in New Zealand? Well, we get just over half as many of our calories from carbohydrate, and remember, in New Zealand, this is mostly coming from processed carbohydrate. We're approaching twice as much protein, and most disturbingly, we have almost 3.5 times as much fat, with over a third of this coming from saturated fat, and that's mostly from dairy. What does this lead to? Well, even with our cholesterol-lowering medications, we end up with a total cholesterol of about 5.4 for New Zealanders over our entire lifespan, which is much higher than any of the 3 populations that I've discussed tonight, and is certainly much higher than any of the experts or the researchers that I've shown you about tonight would ever recommend. What does this lead to? Well, we've already heard that 1 New Zealander will die from cardiovascular disease in every 90 minutes. But we also end up with 2/3 of our adults overweight or obese, a third of our children. We have 250,000 people, more than 250,000 people in New Zealand living with type 2 diabetes. We're adding 40 to this number each day. We have the highest rate of cancer incidence in the world. And of course, these statistics affect our tangata whenua and our Pasifika populations even more so. So given this situation, what do our dietary guidelines encourage? Well, there are 4 separate food groups that should be included every day. We have a separate dairy category, despite the fact that none of the populations we have discussed tonight ever consume dairy. Furthermore, despite the fact that dairy is the #1 source of saturated fat in the New Zealand diet, and we're already getting way too much saturated fat, and also everything that Mike said, and Christina. We also have what can only be described as a separate protein category, which is dominated by high-fat animal foods and also high-fat plant foods, despite the fact that none of the three populations we've discussed earlier tonight consume any of these foods on any more than the rarest occasion. Also, despite the fact that New Zealanders already get more than enough protein and a lot more fat than what they should. So, are these guidelines really helpful, or are they just contributing to the already substantial amount of nutritional confusion out there? I'll leave you guys to ponder that one. But improving our health outcomes could be simple. All we need to do is start encouraging New Zealanders to eat like the people who have the healthiest hearts, as we've discovered tonight. So we could get rid of that redundant dairy category the Canadian dietary guidelines already have. And we could simply start encouraging New Zealanders to eat more beans or legumes, as they clearly don't need any further encouragement to eat the rest of the protein category foods. And of course, as we've seen, there are absolutely no risk of protein deficiency in any case. In other words, we can encourage New Zealanders to eat more beans and legumes, whole grains, and starchy vegetables. But if eating beans, whole grains, and starchy vegetables, some people will say, well, that's a bit foreign for New Zealanders, and probably particularly the people at Ministry of Health will say, well, that's not a very palatable way of doing things, and where are they going to start? What are we going to eat? And this slide is for those people. So I'd be shocked if anyone here in the audience tonight didn't already have at least one of these in their pantry at home already. Or if not, wasn't able to find them within 5 minutes of turning up at the Countdown Pack and Save, Foursquare, New World, or even the Corner Dairy on the way home. And they're actually a really great way to get started. As for Dr. Esselstyn's green leafy vegetables, well, there's a good chance that at least one or two of us in the audience already have this in our fridge at home. Some of you might even have it in your gardens, and I can see a few nods around the room. Silver beet works just fine. And there's even bonus points if you add some vinegar to it, just like Dr. Esselstyn does. And if you were still wondering what kinds of foods New Zealanders might ever be able to eat, and whether that would be a very fun way of eating, we've got plenty of recipes on our Doctors for Nutrition website, so I'd recommend checking it out. You can see there's a wide variety of foods from a bunch of different cuisines. It's cheap, it's tasty, it's colourful, and there's a huge variety of different foods you can have. And there's also some pictures there of the doctors and dietitians from around New Zealand, Australia, and in fact around the world who already eat this way, provided these recipes, and recommend this way of eating for their patients. So I hope from this talk tonight, you've got some ideas about how we can make some insanely great changes for the health of New Zealanders, how simple that could be. And kia ora for the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, EBE. And thank all of you for being here. And I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.